It was a gray Tuesday when Martha Hill walked into St. Agnes Chapel, her steps quiet, steady, and unnoticed. The rain outside tapped gently against stained glass windows as if mourning politely, and inside, people in black whispered, sighed, and checked their watches more than they looked at the casket. Martha did not sit in the front. She didn't sit with the family. She took her place quietly at the far back corner, just beside the last pew near the side exit, the kind of spot chosen by people who expect to be forgotten. To most in the room, she was a stranger. An older woman in a plain blue coat, with shoes that had seen more years than fashion trends. Some glanced at her sideways and assumed she was housekeeping. Others didn't notice her at all, but she noticed everything. The way Charles Worthington's sister dabbed at her eyes without tears. The way his nephew whispered to a man in a navy suit, already discussing the sale of the beach house. The way his lawyer, stiff and precise, clutched a folder like it was worth more than the man they buried. Charles Worthington had been wealthy, very wealthy. Old money, blue-blooded, third-generation estate, and not a trace of humility about it. At least that's what people said. But Martha knew a different version. She had met him by accident 6 years ago in Central Park, feeding ducks. She had brought sunflower seeds, and he had frowned at her at first. But then, after the 4th or 5th Tuesday, when they found themselves on the same bench at the same time again and again, he spoke. And once Charles Worthington began to speak, he didn't stop. It turned out he was lonely. Not the kind of loneliness you cure with crowds or champagne, but the kind that grows in silence, thick and old, like ivy climbing a forgotten wall. Martha never pried. She just listened. Every Tuesday, sometimes Thursdays, he talked about his childhood, his regrets, the war he almost went to but didn't, the woman he loved but lost, the money he made, and the people who loved it more than they ever loved him. She didn't offer advice or flattery. She offered presence. A thermos of tea, a chessboard, a moment of quiet honesty. In a world that demanded performances, Martha gave him permission to be real. She never asked for anything. Not a dime, not a favor, not a future. She wasn't his nurse or secretary or hidden mistress. She was just Martha, a woman with no agenda and a heart still big enough to share. Now, at his funeral, no one knew this. They knew Charles, the tycoon, the man with 5 cars, 2 ex-wives, and a company that once donated $10 million to an art museum just so they'd name a hallway after him. But they didn't know the man who cried when he saw a bird with a broken wing. The man who once wrote poems in secret. The man who said, one cold December afternoon, "Martha, I think you're the only person left who remembers I'm still human." When the lawyer stood to read the will, the air in the chapel changed. Posture straightened. Eyes sharpened. This was what many had come for, not the goodbye, but the reading. The legal man cleared his throat and began with names. Margot, the sister, received the beach house in Cape Cod. Clark, the nephew, got the investment portfolio. Henry, the chauffeur, got the vintage cars. Each name was followed by gasps, nods, and some fake smiles. Then came silence. And then came hers. To Martha Hill, the lawyer read slowly. I leave my primary residence at 314 Chesterfield Lane, my entire personal library, and full publication rights to my memoirs. She listened when no one else remembered I had a story to tell. The room froze. A pause so sharp it cut through the hum of the air conditioning. Someone coughed. Someone else dropped their program. Whispers spread like fire. Who is she? What did she do to him? That woman. But the lawyer wasn't finished. Furthermore, per the deceased's request, Martha Hill shall be granted the floor to read his final note aloud. Martha stood, slowly. She didn't tremble. She didn't apologize. She walked down the aisle like someone who had nothing to prove and everything to honor. When she reached the front, she opened a folded letter. The paper was old, yellowed, handwritten in ink. She looked at it for a moment before reading, and when she spoke, her voice was neither loud nor shaky, but steady, warm, like the hum of a lullaby. If you are hearing this, she began, then I am gone. And most of you are here because of what I had, not who I was. That's fine. I spent years confusing the two myself. But there comes a time in a man's life when the value of a moment outweighs the price of a thing. Martha gave me those moments. She asked for nothing. She reminded me I was not my wealth, not my stocks, not my mistakes. She reminded me I was a man, with thoughts and fears and stories that deserved to be heard, not just document it. So if you're angry, let me ease your concern. You have my money. She has my words. And I promise you, she got the better deal. When Martha finished reading, she didn't look at anyone. She simply folded the letter, handed it back, and walked back to her seat in the last row. The chapel was silent. For once, grief was real. And for the first time that morning, Charles Worthington wasn't just a rich man in a coffin. He was a human being who had been seen and remembered by someone the world called simple. But maybe that's exactly what he needed. And maybe, just maybe, that's what we all need too. After the ceremony, as people filtered out of the chapel, there was a strange silence among them. One not born of grief, but of confusion. The kind that bubbles up when a story you thought you knew gets rewritten in front of your eyes. Martha didn't linger. She had no reason to. She wasn't there to defend herself, to collect praise, or to bask in sudden recognition. She walked back out into the rain. Same coat, same quiet dignity. But before she could reach the gate, someone called after her. Martha, wait. It was the lawyer, Mr. Latham. For years he had handled Charles's affairs, spoken for him in courtrooms, at board meetings, across expensive tables. But now, for the first time, he looked human, not legal. He left something else, he said, reaching into his briefcase. He wrote a letter, just for you. Personal, not part of the will. Martha took it gently, nodded, and walked away. She didn't open it right away. She waited until she got home, until her shoes were dry and the kettle was on. The apartment was modest, filled with books and blankets and the smell of lavender from an old candle she hadn't had the heart to throw out. She sat at the table, unfolded the letter, and began to read. Martha, it began, if you are reading this, then I've done something right at last. I know you'll hate the fuss. You always did. You'll say I've made things more complicated. You'll say I should have left you in peace. But I couldn't, because you never let me sit in silence without knowing someone was listening. And I wanted the world to know what that meant. I wanted them to see what I saw every Tuesday. That peace doesn't come from money, or legacy, or even justice. It comes from being known. He continued, I've spent most of my life building a kingdom. Marble floors, wine cellars, titles on office doors. And yet I never felt at home in any of it. Not until you brought soup and a book of poetry and sat beside me without asking for anything. You reminded me I was more than my balance sheet. You reminded me I was enough. So I left you what mattered to me, the library and the stories. Because you already gave me the only thing I didn't know I needed. Someone who cared quietly. Martha's eyes filled, but no tears fell. Not yet. She folded the letter and placed it beside the window, where sunlight could find it tomorrow. Over the following weeks, the world took notice. The story hit local news, then national. The quiet woman and the billionaire's last words. Reporters called her. Publishers reached out, eager to acquire the rights to the memoirs Charles left behind. Some wanted interviews, some offered speaking engagements, others wanted to turn it all into a movie. Martha declined most of them. She wasn't interested in turning her Tuesdays into a spectacle. But she did say yes to one thing. A small community reading of the unpublished memoirs, held in the local library, open to anyone who wanted to listen. On the night of the event, chairs filled slowly, not with cameras or executives, but with teachers, widows, veterans, and quiet people who had spent most of their lives in the background. People who knew what it was like to be overlooked. People who had sat in corners, like Martha, and watched the world forget they existed. Martha stood at the front, holding the first pages of Charles's memoir. Her voice was gentle but clear. My name is Martha Hill, she began. I am not a lawyer. I'm not family. I'm not important by most people's standards. But I was a friend. And this is the story of a man who forgot he had won. She read for 40 minutes. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just true. Page after page of Charles's fears, his regrets, his shame at chasing legacy over love. How he hid behind stocks because vulnerability felt too expensive. How he had money to build monuments, but no one to share tea with until Martha. When she finished, the room was silent. Then came the first clap, then another, then a wave of applause not for her performance, but for the story, for the honesty, for the reminder that behind every polished obituary, there is a life lived in rough drafts. Afterward, people lined up, not to praise Martha, but to share their own stories. A man in his 70s spoke of a friend he lost touch with. A woman confessed she hadn't visited her brother in 8 years. A teenager said he'd never thought to ask his grandfather about his childhood. And something shifted. In that library, healing began, not because a rich man had died, but because a simple woman had made sure he was remembered not as a headline, but as a human. In the months that followed, Martha used the proceeds from the memoir's publication to set up a foundation, the Listening Bench. It funded programs for senior citizens to record and share their life stories, for free, archived in public libraries across the country. No filters, no fame, just voices, stories, truth. She never called herself a founder. She never wanted a statue or a plaque. Her photo wasn't on the website. But in quiet corners of America, older men and women sat down with volunteers and spoke, sometimes for the first time in decades. And they did it because someone like Martha showed that being heard matters. Years later, when Martha passed, the news didn't run headlines. There were no morning talk show tributes. But in libraries from Boston to Portland, from Birmingham to San Diego, candles were lit quietly by bookshelves. Volunteers paused their recordings. Someone read from the first page of Charles's memoir. To the woman who sat beside me when I had nothing left to prove, thank you. Because in the end, the world may remember big names and fortunes, but the soul remembers something else entirely. It remembers the sound of being seen.